So good evening. Very warm welcome to you all to the LSE Department of Economic History annual Epstein Lecture. This year it's a great pleasure to welcome Professor Michela Giorcelli as our Epstein Lecturer. I'm Patrick Wallace. I'm a professor in the Department of Economic History and its current head of department. And as such, it's always my privilege to chair this lecture. Before we get on to business, just a couple of practicalities. The event is recorded. It's going out live, but it will also be made available online afterwards. After the lecture, we will have time for questions, and I would encourage you very much to think about questions and be ready to present them. And this extends to those of you who are joining us online. We do have a system whereby you'll be able to ask questions, and they will be fed through to me through our excellent digital infrastructure. So please ask questions, and at the end, I will invite and voice some of those questions. If you do want to ask a question from online, please include your name and affiliation and where you're coming from so that we can introduce you to the room. So the lecture. This annual lecture series was established in the memory of Professor Larry Epstein. He was a dearly missed colleague, and he was also one of the most exciting economic historians of his generation. Larry was a mentor and friend to many young economic historians. I benefited personally from his support, his criticism, and robust engagement with ideas that he disagreed with vigorously. And so when we had to think about how to remember Larry, this was a very natural way to do so, to invite an outstanding young economic historian who's made some progress in their career, enough to show quite what they're able to do, but to bring them in at a point when we wouldn't necessarily have this kind of forum and space. So this is about showcasing rising stars in economic history. Recent lecturers have included Mariam Wanamaker, Mohamed Saleh, who's somewhere in the room, Marcella Alsa, Mark Kayama, and last year, James Feigenbaum. And this is the 17th lecture in its series. And our lecturer, for our 17th lecturer, Michela, is an associate professor at UCLA in the Department of Economics. We're extremely pleased that she's able to join us here today. And we're very pleased because in what really is a very short few years, she's established herself at the forefront of what is one of the hardest questions in economic history. That is, what drives productivity growth? Explaining productivity in detail is one of the great dreams of our discipline and several others. The level that Michela is engaged with in her work is, I think, one of the most relevant levels of detail that one could imagine. That's the reason why firms achieve different levels of productivity, right down at the actors of the economy. That this matters is not just a question of historical interest, although obviously those of us in the room are happy with those questions. It's a question that matters enormously to society at large, particularly as we wrestle with slowdowns in productivity in the UK and other parts of the developed world in recent decades. And some of the answers to this puzzle, they surely lie in the hands of some of the people that I think Michela will be talking about tonight. These are the managers, the policymakers, the scientists, the politicians that she's studied. And it's partly this, it's the importance of her research, of bringing real empirical rigor, bringing real social science to our understanding of what this group of critical actors do in the modern economy and what they do to shift productivity, or maybe sometimes not shift it, that I think is really so exciting in her work. So today, she's going to talk about some of these issues. There's a long list of things, if you really want to read all that she's done, some of these issues in the context of the Second World War, in her lecture on the diffusion of soft technologies during and after World War II. So please join me in welcoming Michela to the stage, and thank you for joining us.
Hi everyone, I am very excited to be here today. I would like to thank you, Patrick, for the very generous introduction and all you being here. So before getting started about talking about productivity, why productivity is important and we care about productivity so much, I would also join Patrick in sharing a few words about Larry. I didn't have the pleasure of meeting him in person, but of course I did know his works very well. So I don't want to go through all the numerous contributions that he did and made to the economic history discipline, but I would just like to underscore the legacy that his works have for the field and, of course, also for today's lecture. In particular, the fact that knowing and understanding the past is essential for understanding the present. How different disciplines are complementary. History, economics, sociology all play together in our studies, and I will touch during the lecture on some of these aspects and why they combine together in determining productivity and soft technologies as the title of the talk. But I think that the part of his research that is more related to what we're going to talk about today is the importance of technology in shaping human capital. And in particular today we're talking about how soft technologies could shape human capital and sustain productivity growth. So the productivity slowdown is a hot topic in almost all developed countries, as Patrick said. So here we can look at labor productivity in Britain and see how there is a slowdown since 2007. So productivity grew substantially between 2000 and 2007. There was a decrease in productivity during the 2008 crisis, but then productivity, even if start growing again, did so at a pace that is substantially lower than the first few years of the 2000s. If you are familiar with the Draghi reports of the European Union released this past September, lack of productivity growth, like an increase in productivity gap between Europe and the US, has seen one of the most urgent issues to face in order for European firms to gain and remain competitive. But the natural question is, why do we care about productivity so much? And the answer is that it is arguably the most important determinant of living standards. So in terms of productivity, we can see productivity in two different ways. First one is just how much output could be produced given a set of inputs. So if we think about firms or two countries that can produce a higher amount of output using the same amount of input, one country, one firm is more productive than the other. This is the definition that I will mostly use during the talk today. But we can also think more simple in terms of labor productivity, either the output of the revenues that workers are able to produce. So once again, more productive workers can produce a higher level of output. Differences in productivity, according both the definition, could explain up to 30% of the differences in GDP per capita across countries. So an important determinant of living standard wealth of nations goes back to productivity. But on top of this comparison across different countries, it has been documented that there are large and persistent productivity spread even within countries and within narrowly defined sectors. So for instance, in the US, even if we consider sectors producing very homogeneous goods like concrete, the most productive firm is twice as more productive as the least productive firms, meaning that the most productive firms could produce twice as much as output as the least productive firm. This is for the US. If we take other countries, for instance, India and China, productivity spread seems even larger in the ratio of 5 to 1. but also productivity is very persistent over time. Like 80% of the current level of productivity of a firm is determined by its productivity in the past years. So it looks like that some businesses are able to understand in which way they could be productive and maintain it, while some other businesses systematically fail to do so. So the next important question is what determines productivity? Is productivity so important for living standards? What are the determinants? And there are two major determinants of productivity that past literature has brought up. The first one, the more traditional one, is differences in hard technological innovations, as this that is embedded in patent, information communication technologies, and so on. But more recently, also other technologies, soft technologies, have been studied and systematically measured. We're talking about management, and management is the focus of today's talk. In particular, we will discuss management and productivity growth in the context of World War II. What is management? This is probably the hardest question. I wish I have an answer. It's probably the hardest question that we can ask, in the sense that we can think management as a set of practices, as the management system that the firms put in place. Recent work have tried to establish a set of good managerial practices and systematically measure them across firms and across countries. But management is, of course, also the people that put in place these practices, CEOs, managerial talents that firms could acquire, and that construct, that form the so-called managerial capital, like the human capital that is specific to the implementation of managerial practices. How can we incorporate management in a production function? So we can think that management could affect productivity through three main channels. The first one is technology. We can think that management acts as a technology in the sense that it increases the productivity of other inputs, mostly labor and capital. Said in another way, we can also think that as long as the level of management remains low, even increasing labor and capital does not increase productivity that much. An instance that could explain why some countries remain poor, some firms remain little productive, no matter how much inputs they employ in the production process. Then the second channel is efficiency. Managers could better use the inputs, the resources of firms. So we can think about a better allocation of resources within the firm. And finally, management could affect human capital directly in a bunch of different ways, mostly through the allocation of workers to the most appropriate tasks, on the one hand, but also in terms of acquisition of the best workers available on the market, or by the retention of the workers that are more important for determining firm performance. This goes back to the fact that replacing key employees is particularly challenging, and good managers are able to avoid that these talents are lost by the firms. What we're gonna talk about today is an historical period of huge productivity growth, that is World War II. And World War II has been defined as an extraordinary surge of growth, mostly by Chandler and his scholars since 1977, in references to the technological advancement, the development of new products that occurred between 1940 and 1945. In particular, the US government signed more than 200,000 contracts for research and development through academia, private industries, with the goal of increasing innovation. And this was reflected in a number of new products, some used directly at the war, some that had huge spillovers in terms of everyone's life. Just a simple example, internet was first developed in the context of World War II and now is affecting our life deeply. What I will argue in today's talk is that World War II was also a major turning point for US businesses, in the sense that the implementation of key managerial practices increased the productivity of firms in the short term, but was also able to put them on a higher growth path that lasted at least a decade and created a set of good managerial practices that after the war were exported in Western Europe and Japan, contributing to creating the Toyota way of management. In doing so, my goal is also to bring together two distinctive literatures. The first one that underscored the importance of managers and managerial talent in shaping US large enterprises, but also more recent literature pioneered notably by John Verrinen and Nick Bloom, that the implementation of good managerial practices can have large effects on firm productivity and performance. So I think that the bridge between these two literatures relies on thinking that there was no quantitative assessment of the importance of the implementation of managerial practices in the context of World War II, which was also a turning point for the importance of management, at least in the Western world. So just to give you a brief overview of what we're going to talk today, we will start with a brief history of development of management. We talk about World War II, the development of the training within the industry program in the US, how the principle of the training within the industry were exported after World War II, and then some conclusive remarks. So to get started, the concept of management, as we know today, goes back to the Industrial Revolution. Before the Industrial Revolution, the scale of production was very limited. Businesses were averaging between 1 to 4 employees, so there was no really need of coordinating the production. The owner could observe what his employees were doing. The situation started gradually changing since the 1840s, mostly in the US, due to the rise of big businesses that needed a managerial hierarchy that could coordinate the effort of different plants, maybe located in different areas of the countries. Huge infrastructure constructions, notably the railroads and the telegraphs, rely mostly on management skills in coordinating the effort. Between the first and the second Industrial Revolution, there was also a change where the leading figures in firms. We can think that the first Industrial Revolution was mostly led by entrepreneurs who were able to think outside the box, having new ideas, developing new projects that lead to the great extent of innovation during this period. The second Industrial Revolution saw a prominent feature of managers who think within the box by solving coordination problems and allocating resources within the firm. After that, managerial theories, managerial organizations start becoming more and more important. We are towards the end of the 19th century, beginning of the 20th century. The most famous one are probably the scientific management theory that were mostly focused on increasing labor productivity. And in particular, there were a lot of systematic studies that also were across the fields. Sociology, psychology really start analyzing management and how, for instance, workers were doing a lot of unnecessary movements while, in particular, in the car industry, so while assembling a car. And the reduction of these movements, for instance, in the Ford factory, allowed a drop in the production time from 12 hours to 2.5 hours, de facto allowing the mass production of cars and the start of mass production. A moment in which the demand for goods largely increased was World War I. And in particular in shipbuilding, the demand increased by 10 times in 1917 relative to the pre-war period. And so US firms were in the need of increasing production, productivity, and trained workers. And they created a four-step method of learning by doing to doing so. The results were pretty amazing. 500,000 workers were trained, and a new vessel was launched every 5 days between 2017 and 2018. However, this productivity increase remained mostly confined in shipbuilding, and some of these techniques were completely abandoned with the end of World War I. During the 20s and the 30s, however, the idea of productivity, and in particular what was defined at the time optimal productivity, remain in the management debate quite a bit. So compared to the early theories of Taylor, for instance, now the idea is no longer to just increase labor productivity, but increase productivity more in general. So we can think that this concept is closer to the total factor productivity we discussed today. And there were even attempts to run quote-quote experiments. The most famous one are the Hawthorne experiments run in different ways between 1924 and 1933, whose goal was to test what could increase firm productivity, for instance, improvement in working condition, or try different combination of teamwork management in order to see in which conditions workers could perform better. These experiments were quite innovative for the time. There was an attempt to change conditions in some plants but not in some others, so using modern terms like a treatment and control group, and also have a systematic data collection, including interviews. So these studies produce an incredible amount of work of material whose main results were mixed, in the sense that on the one hand, these studies confirm that matter management increased workers' productivity on the one hand, but on the other hand, that also psychological aspects are very important determinants of workers' productivity. The so-called Hawthorne effects stem from these experiments, the fact that even in plants in which conditions were not changed, workers report better working conditions just because they were taught that something would have changed and probably put more effort in light of this perceived change that didn't really happen. There were also some major shortcomings in the data collection that can cast some doubt about the results, in the sense that, for instance, worker productivity was measured pre-experiments on Friday and post-experiment on Monday, so it's hard to know if the increased productivity was the effect of better managerial practices or the effect of weekends and some rest. Okay, so with the Hawthorne experiment and some other studies in the 30s, World War II was about to start. And the results that I'm going to present in the next few slides are mostly based on a paper co-authored with Nicola Bianchi back in 2022. And what happened during World War II was that there was a surge in the demand for US products as soon as 1939, even before the US officially entered World War II. That would happen a couple of years later in December 1941. So these orders were largely exceeding the US productive capacity. Moreover, since the US were thinking about entering the war at some point, Men in working age were expecting to serve, with the result of making the productivity issue even more salient. So in an effort to increase production and productivity, the US government decided to sponsor the training within the industry program. That was a management training program for US war contractors, so for firms working in the defense industry, that ran from August 1940 to September 1945 and was one of the first emergency programs after the fall of France. So the program had very ambitious goals. The underlying purposes was to assist all firms in the defense industry to meet their manpower need by training within the industry each worker. This is something that, of course, didn't happen. World War II was a moment in which the entire US economy was working for the production effort, for the war effort. Resources were scarce, and there was still not a complete agreement between the government and the labor division, the Manpower Commission, that management was really important. So the question was whether management training should be implemented in a moment in which production had to increase as much as possible. At the end, some agreements were reached, and the training within the industry program was launched. So the training within the industry program was based on three sets of practices that we can see very related to what we think is good management today. The first practice was job instructor that had the goal of establishing standard procedure for operation, improving of working conditions, for instance, lighting, job safety, regular maintenance of the machines, recording of reasons for breakdown in order to create a firm-specific memory. Every time there was an issue, a solution had to be found, but if all the issues were recorded and the solutions as well, it could have been easier to fix them since most of the issues could be quite repetitive. The second model was focused on job relations. We can think about human resources management in today's terms that aim at improving the relationship with the workforce, training workers, and also implement performance-based incentive systems. Why was that important? Well, of course, in the context of the war, avoiding any type of production disruption due to workforce strike or injuries or in general mismatch between the worker skills and the jobs that were assigned were particularly important. And finally, job methods that had the goal of simplifying and improving the methods for doing jobs. So having like reducing inventory, production planning, prioritization of orders, that were all aspects particularly important in the context of the war to not having a production disruption, but also to make sure that the most important orders were the first to be delivered. Just to give you an idea of how the program worked, so the contractors that were eligible to participate in it were roughly 23,000. But as often happened in business training program, not all of them wanted to do so. So most programs during World War II, and even after World War II, were implemented on a voluntary basis. So more or less half of work contractors applied for the program, the other half did not. We can see that there is no evidence of differences in the geographical distribution between the two types of firms. Of course, most of firms at the time were located in the northeast and midwest part of the country. some in the South in an effort to industrialize the South that the US government undertook during World War II, and some were on the West Coast. Just to give you a sense of how these applicant firms were, because I think an important question is to understand whether these firms really need managerial training, or maybe they were already very productive, and so the training was not needed. So these plants were huge. They were among the largest firms of the country. They have on average 6 plants. They were employing 1,000 workers. Most of them were in the manufacturing sector, but as the war effort, of course, involved the entire economy, also transportation, services, and agricultural firms were able to participate in this program. In terms of representation of LUS firms, in terms of employment, these firms accounted for roughly 40% of the US labor force working in manufacturing in 1940. So we can think that they were a good representation of the US labor market. Despite that, however, these firms do not appear to be very productive. If we look at the measure of productivity, we are below 2, which is a pretty low number. Of course, it's always very hard to make comparison about productivity estimates across different countries or different historical periods. So we can also look at other indicators, for instance, return on assets that were only 3%. Inventory was massive. It accounted for 80% of current sales. Importantly, these firms were facing major disruption related to World War II. On average, more than 20% of their workforce was drafted at some point between 1940 and 1945, and half of them had to switch production in order to meet the war effort. So, even if these firms were large, had higher sales and higher profits, there was still a substantial margin of improvements thanks to implementation of new practices. So the idea of the implementation of the training within the industry program at the firm level was to have a highly standardized implant training that was 10 hours in 5 sections in a very simple way. And most of the teaching methods, so the learning by doing, goes back to the training program in shipbuilding that was implemented during World War I. The firms which received this management training and were interviewed in order to assess the success of the program were particularly excited about it. Manufacturing companies were reporting a 50% decrease in defective product after the implementation of systematic factory operation. Steel companies reported a 50% drop in complaint cases after better relationship with their labor force. Textile warehouse reported a 48% decrease in man-hour to wrap operation after the job methods implementation. So overall, it looks like that at least at the time, the program was perceived as a large success. The major problem that the US government had to face, on top that not all the firms want to participate, was that there was lack of trained personnel to deliver the teaching models. So the instructors in the training within the industry program were prepared through 50-hour class by the WWII Institute. They were hired either full-time or part-time. Some of them were industrymen that wanted to preserve and continue their jobs. And they were too few in comparison to the applicant firms. So they specialized only in 1J models, and they were not employed for the entire duration of the program. So these are two important consequences in terms of the delivery of the program. First one is that there were too few instructors. So among all applicants, only roughly half of them eventually received the training. And there was also a difference in the combination of training that firms received. The very lucky one that we see on the left receive all training all 3 modules. There are 7% of firms. Most receive a combination of 2 modules, while some only receive training in 1 module. And I think this is an interesting feature because it allows to study not only whether management improves firm performance, but also if there are differences in the managerial practices that affect firm outcomes. Moving to some regressions, and I'll try to be less technical as possible here, what we're doing is estimating the effect of participating into this program on firm outcomes, the outcomes of firm I in time period T. The 3 main outcomes that we look are sales, productivity, return on assets. Then we also have some measure of managerial practices that we can use. And we look at indicators for whether firms participated or no in the program and the years before and after the implementation of the program. We collected data at the firm level that allows us to follow all firms from 5 years before the program to 10 years after the program. Importantly, this analysis is performed on firms that applied to the program and get it or didn't get it based on the scarcity of instructors. So it's not a comparison between firms that apply and firms that did not apply to the program, which of course may have been different in terms of many dimensions. Their characteristics that we can observe, but also unobservable characteristics, like, for instance, the desire of improvement or the desire of success of the own managers. So the results indicate that the effect of attending the training within the industry program were quite big. If we look at the 5 years before the implementation of the program, we can see that there is no differences between firms who eventually got it and firms which eventually didn't get it, which is reassuring. These firms do not appear to be different to begin with, so there was not selection into the program based on the performance of the firms. And then there was a systematic increase in sales, pretty sizable, 5% increase within a year, 22% increase in 8 years, and a cumulative effect of 16% increase after 10 years. Here I put 2 red lines that correspond to the moment in which firms were trained, which is year 0. Since the training happened between 1940 and 1945, but most firms were trained between 1941 and 1944, we can think that 3 to 4 years after year 0 is when World War II was finishing. And so we can see that this increase in sales is definitely not driven by the war per se, but continues also in peacetime. If we look at productivity, we can see that the results are even larger than in sales. Again, there is not that much going on in the pre-period. The sales increased by, productivity increased by 5% in a year and reached a 36% cumulative effect in 10 years. Now, you may wonder why sales increased not as much as productivity. Usually, if we think that sales are a good proxy for output of the firm, and productivity is driven by an increase in output, not a decrease in inputs, the two should move more or less at the same pace. What we find in this case is that there was a substantial reduction in the usage of raw materials by firms who attended the program. So that's why productivity is increasing even more than sales, because firms could produce both more output and they were using fewer inputs. And finally, we can look at return on assets as the measure of profitability of the firms. Once again, there is not much going on in the years before the program, and then we have a 10% increase in profitability over 10 years by firms that receive the training within the industry program. Now, I think that the next question is trying to understand a little bit better why there was this extraordinary growth in productivity. Is it just related to the implementation of specific practices? Can we think that the government helped this firm more just because they were trained, which, by the way, would have made a lot of sense? The other big question in this, not just in this paper, but in this literature, is about management versus managers. Was management to improve, like a better implementation of managerial practices, or just managers got better? And finally, the supply chain. So were there spillovers on the supply chain of these firms that could have made them more productive? So let's start with implementation of managerial practices. We find that the short answer is yes. There was a substantial increase in the implementation of managerial practices. For a few of them, selected sample of practices, we can follow them over time. And we can see that the effects were quite persistent and, importantly, related to the training that firms receive. For instance, we have a systematic reduction in worker injuries for firms that receive the factory operation training that continue up to the end of the sample. For the other two groups of firms, not much was going on. Once firms improved the relationship with the workforce, there was a higher probability of training the workers on the job. Of course, this makes a lot of sense during the war years. But we can see that the training continued, even increased after the war. So it looks like that the firms realized the importance of work training and the sharp reduction in the number of strikes, again, during the war, but the effects persisted quite a bit after the war itself. And finally, if we think about the production planning, we have a substantial reduction in the inventory of the firms. And so we saw that inventory was 80% of assets, so was huge before the war. So reduction of inventory definitely played a role, was quite important even after the end of the war. Did the government granted more contracts to these firms after they received the training? It looks like it was not the case. The value of the contract, the numbers of the contract, even the refunds that firms got after the war that we can see as a proxy for the help that the government was giving to these firms to resume their normal operations after the disruption caused by the war are not differential. If anything, they are negative between firms that receive or not receive the training within the industry program. So probably the effort in terms of management was not exploited well by the government. I think that at some point there was lack of coordination or like good management in a way between the different units, who was allocating the contract, who was managing the program. And so at the end, we do not find evidence of better relation with the government. So this is definitely not driving our results. We can also think about the effects of management versus managers. This is something that we cannot observe perfectly, in the sense that we don't know exactly who got the training within the firm. What we can observe is what happened when, after the program, managers left the firm. We have three tercile based on the share of managers that were working there during the war and left afterwards. And we can see that no matter what, the effects on sales and productivity remain pretty large, persistent, and also they were following kind of a similar pattern. So overall, this seems to suggest that is not the role of specific managers, just in a few firms, that is driving all our results. And finally, we can look at the effects in the supply chain, and we can find that indeed almost all firms that were related, horizontally or vertically related to firms that received the training, increased their productivity with a different magnitude across the different type of training that the major firms receive. which is also associated to some implementation of managerial practices. So we can think about a knowledge spillover channel within the supply chain that is going on here. So to sum up, were the results driven by the implementation of managerial practices? It looks like it was the case. A relation with the government, not much. Was more management or managers? I think it was more management, even if, of course, higher managers who left determined slightly lower improvement in firm performance, and also increase in productivity of firms in the supply chain. They could have, in turn, increase even more the productivity of the firms themselves. The other thing that is worth mentioning is that while vertical spillovers were positive and quite sizable, horizontal spillovers were not. If we look at firms that were nearby, firms that apply to the program, but decide not to apply, so these are firms that were eligible to apply but decide not to do so, we can see that there is almost a zero effect. And the zero effect is persistent both if we look at firms in the same sector or in different sectors. Why this distinction is important? Because we can think that firms in the same sector could be either exposed to competition effect, treated firms are doing much better, they could be somehow harmed. And we can also think that the sharing of knowledge between treated firms and potential competitors was somehow limited or maybe even avoided. But even if we look at the firms in different sectors, so firms in different sectors should not be affected by competition, but they were also not positively affected by being close to firms that were doing so well in the market. Which leads to another question, which is why the firms that decided not to apply for the training within the industry did not adopt these principles even after World War II, when the other firms have proven to be so successful. And these principles were actually exported mostly in Western Europe and Japan. So I think that we can have different explanations for this. One for sure is that the US economy had a large economic expansion in the 50s, and so probably the training was not considered that important anymore. And that probably the fact that the government could offer these services even after the war could seen to some extent as a limitation of their autonomy. So the program was eventually dismissed in 1945, even if you're thinking about the cost-benefit analysis, the higher profit that firms made would just be equivalent to the cost of 21 months of training. So in terms of the cost-benefit analysis, the program was definitely a big success. Now, the US government, in light of the lack of interest for the practices in the US, decided to export them after World War II. Most of the results I'm going to present are based on a paper that I published in 2019. These, at least for Western Europe, these exports of managerial practices was part of the Marshall Plan, a plan of economic and financial aid that the US implemented between 1948 and 1952 to help firms recover after World War II. The aid of the Marshall Plan were overall successful. The GDP industrial indices reached the 1938 level in a great majority of Western Europe by 1952, or a few years after that. However, the US expert noted how there was an increasing productivity gap between US and European firms. Actually, this gap was not caused by World War II per se. The gap was increasing since the 30s, probably mostly related to the changes in managerial practices that we already described in the 20s and the 30s, but of course the war didn't help to close the gap. Silberman was one of the prominent experts who visited Europe after the war, actually argued that lack of management in European firms was a more severe problem than the damages caused by the war itself. It's probably an extreme statement, but I think it speaks to the importance and the attention that the US gave to managerial practices during the war. So in order to close this productivity gap, the US decided to implement another program, the productivity program, between 1952 and 1958 that involved the transfer of US management to European firms. In particular, European managers were sent to the US for a period of 3-4 months in order to work and learn from European managers. And the European firms could also buy technological advanced machines that were built in the US and had higher technology than those available in Europe. I so far studied the effect of the productivity program in the context of Italy. Just to give you a sense of how the program worked, the kind of comparison that we're making here, the firms that were eligible to participate in the program were small and medium-sized firms in the manufacturing sector, roughly 6,000 firms coming from a few regions. And the idea of this phase of the program was to test its effectiveness before a nationwide implementation. So the regions were chosen to be representative of the different areas of Italy: Northwest, Northeast, Central, South, and then Island. Okay, so these were the firms that were eligible to participate in the program. Also in this case, we find that not all of them applied, like 60% applied, 40% did not apply. So probably not all the firms believed that management was important or did have this desire of improvement. And among the applicants, they could decide whether they want to send their managers in the US, purchases the new machines, or both. Rejection was almost non-existent. Only 30 applications were rejected, the firms that were either in very bad shape or that made huge mistakes in the applications. However, the US at some point ran out of budget, and so they moved from the regional level implementation of the program to a smaller province level. In particular, they selected one province for each of the micro area that were initially eligible to participate in the program, and only firms in these areas eventually received the training that they applied for. So I think this is very interesting because we could observe which training firms wanted to receive and which training they eventually received. Okay, so the empirical specification is very similar to what we saw before. We're looking at outcomes of a given plant in a given year, and we regress it on an indicator whether they receive a particular type of treatment, considering the comparison group of firms that applied for the same treatment but did not receive it. So first of all, I would like to look for a second at the survival probability that these firms had. If we want to see what is the long-run effect of management, we want to follow these firms over time, it's important to understand how many firms survive. We're talking about small firms, not firms as large as the US, and we all know that small firms have a pretty high failure rate. Relative to larger firms. So if we look at the failure rate in the 5 years after the implementation of the program, it is quite comparable. 97% for firms that were treated, 94% for firms that were not treated is not a huge difference. But if we look at the effects after 15 years, 90% of firms that got the training survived versus 68% of firms that didn't get the training. And I think this is a quite striking result that suggests why it's important and why economic history could be used to study long-term outcomes. Very often when we do policy evaluation, we just focus on the short run, but sometimes results could take time to materialize, as shown in this case. So if we look at the effects on the implementation of such practices, we can see also in this case, in the 5 years before the program, there was not that much going on. Firms that eventually received the training do not appear to be better than firms that did not. We have a 15% increase in productivity 1 year after the intervention, and a cumulative effect of almost 50% after 15 years. So these are for sure very large results. And in order to see whether they were comparable to some recent findings on management implementation in modern setting, here I'm looking at some other works. So the baseline is the paper that I presented before, large firms and small firms. So we can see that year and year, for instance, the effects are quite in line. So it looks like that at least between the 40s and the 50s, the good implementation of managerial practices was a kind of comparable between small Italian firms and large US firms. If we look at short-term results of randomized controlled trial about consulting services in India, we can see that the results are even larger. So the increase in performance of Italian or US firms was quite substantial, but definitely we can think about even larger margin of improvement of firms today when these managerial practices programs are implemented. Now, we also saw that another component of the program was the technology transfer. So firms could purchase machineries from the US. If we do so, we can see that the effects are much smaller in magnitude and not that persistent. There is not that much going on up to 3 years after the implementation of the program, and then only a 10% increase in productivity after 15 years, which is way lower than the 50% increase that we documented for firms that received the management intervention. And we can also look at the complementarity for firms that apply for both interventions. And here there are a lot of numbers, but the takeaway is that there was a 14% additional increase in productivity for firms that got both the training relative to the sum of the productivity increase of firms that receive the two programs separately. So overall, there was more than 60% productivity increase after 15 years. So the program was particularly successful in Italy, and even if I didn't collect the data, the reports at the time indicate that all Western Europe was particularly happy about the transfer of these managerial principles from the US. But the US also transferred these managerial technologies to Japan. And the Japanese case is particularly interesting because Japanese firms were able to merge together two components of the US managerial practices, the training within the industry principles, but also quality control and statistical methods that were also introduced during the war. They were not part of this training, but they were quite important during the war. That were combined with local needs, in particular learning by doing as a way to solve the language, the difference in languages, like the communication barrier between US experts that visited Japan and Japanese managers that have to implement these practices. But also the idea of a production just in time solve the space constraint problem that most Japanese firms had. So we saw that one of the key principles of the training within the industry was producing, prioritizing delivery of the orders, and also try to reduce the inventory as much as possible, that we can see somehow related to the development development of the Toyota management system that in fact became prevalent in the 60s and mostly in the 70s. So at some point, Japanese firms overtook US companies. They became more productive. US market was flooded by Japanese cars in the 80s. And at that point, US organized training trips for Japanese managers to go to the US, teach the US managers what they learn based on the Toyota management system. So in a way, the US export back the practices that they have themselves developed during the war in the 80s. But I think that this is an important example on how productivity can vary substantially across countries and across time, and that even a big push in increasing productivity may not have long-lasting effects if it is completely abandoned, while other countries, for instance, the Japanese example, could catch up quite quickly. So I think I'm out of time, but I'm also ready for the conclusions. So I think that what this lecture discussed was how World War II dramatically changed firm management that had a long-lasting effects on production and productivity of firms that were trained in the war context, complementarities with technologies, but also these results, I think, that show that managerial practices could be adapted and adopted and work in different contexts and in firms of different size. What can we learn by the experience of World War II? So first of all, World War II TWI principles are still taught today. And if you think that production have dramatically changed, production methods have dramatically changed between the war and today, managerial principle, what we think is good management today, has not changed that much. So I think that the main policy implications are that managerial practices could work in different contexts. So we can definitely learn from the past in order to try to understand how the diffusion of these practices could affect firm production or productivity in a modern setting. But I think it also speaks about the importance of evaluating the long-term impact of such policies. As we saw, most of the effect took a few years to get at scale and persisted in the long run. So sometimes when some policies are considered ineffective, it could also be because they are evaluated in a short time period. But I think that it also speaks about how economic history could be important and useful to understand the present and its implication for the present. So I'm gonna stop here. Thank you so much for your attention. It was a great pleasure and honor to be here. And I'm more than happy to take any questions or comments or suggestions that you may have. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much indeed. We do indeed have time for questions. I find it tremendously reassuring as a talker, as someone who's spent 4 years as an academic manager. I worry slightly I may have done the wrong course, but you know, we can find that out. Can I just open a little bit? There's time obviously for people to put their hands up and there in the room, and if you are joining us online, please enter questions. They will be fed through to my trusty iPad. But let me just ask one question that struck me listening to you, which is, these were incredibly impactful training, yet they didn't spread. You know, and all these other companies, there were millions of dollars left on the sidewalk, so to speak. And you mentioned maybe they felt they were growing fast enough, but is there anything else going on? I mean, why are companies missing out on what's such an amazing opportunity?
Yeah, no, I totally agree, and I think that this is the big open question in the management literature, in the sense that, yes, spillovers effect at the time were overall limited, but still today, management spillovers remain pretty limited. I think it's hard to answer your question. My understanding could be that either firms don't realize how important management is until they are forced to adopt these practices. Some of the practices that we discussed, or they're still taught today, are pretty simple, pretty basic, right? So, we should record the reason for breakdowns for the machines. It's not something particularly complicated, but can have huge effects on productivity. So this could be something that that firms may not realize until they see that it actually works. The other problem could be that firms could observe the competitors becoming more successful, but they could not understand why this is the case. Maybe they think that it's something else rather than the implementation of managerial practices. For instance, in the war setting, they could have thought that because these firms were chosen to go the training, they were also doing better due to connection with the government or whatever. And the other thing that I think applies mostly to small and medium-sized firms is that not all firms have desire to grow and improve. Like the implementation of managerial practices requires some changes in the production. They could even become structural changes. If firms become more productive, at some point they could or should expand their volume or production, and not all firms have the desire to do so. And this is again a case that is observed in the context of developing countries.
Well, that's really interesting. So some of us want to leave the money on the sidewalk in some senses, right?
Yeah.
I've got a bunch of questions in the room. There's a few coming in, so I'm going to just work through the list a little bit. Let me start with Chris, because yours was the first hand that I saw, and I will work on from there.
Thank you for a great talk. I'm looking at the poster behind you of Rosie the Riveter and want to ask about feminization. So there's going to be a big temporary influx of women into the labor market. That's going to have management implications. I can imagine if your J, human resources policy on the job training, you might think very differently if you're expecting the women also to leave at the end of the war. So how does that match on with your outcomes? Are these very feminized sectors that take the training? Do you know something about that?
I have to say that there was a substantial heterogeneity in the sense that some of these firms could maintain their workforce, or they could recover their workforce after the war. Others could not. In general, we look at different dimensions of heterogeneity in the papers in terms of the number of, like the share of managers who left the firm, how many, like how big the disruption caused by the war was in terms of workers' draft, and also in terms of change in the production. And in almost all these cases, we find that yes, firms that had fewer managers that left, fewer workers that were drafted, that didn't change their production much, even higher performance. But the effects of management seems to be positive, large, and long-lasting almost along all these firms. So it's not that some specific issues caused by the war seems to explain whether the results are there or not.
Okay, let me move on. Why don't we go with Tim, because he's right beside Chris, and that's efficient, and then we'll go to Mohammed because he's done this before.
We like productivity. I wanted to ask about the initial conditions of the firm, because you showed that productivity rose, and I wanted to know whether that's caused by the initial level of productivity. So is it that bad firms become average firms become good, and everybody moves up the same? Or is it that bad firms become good, but good firms remain where they are? Or is it that superstars become even better?
So all firms improve to some extent, but the firms for which the improvements were the largest are those who were on the bottom part of the productivity distribution before the war. So we can think that the bad firms become quite good, and also better firms become even better, but the change is not that large.
Brilliant. I've got some questions coming online. If you're posting a question to us online, please do include your name so that we can call you out. Let's go with Mohammed, and then we'll bring someone in from online.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, thanks a lot, Michela. That's a great presentation. I was thinking, I had two questions. One is about like opening a bit the black box of the management practices here, and trying to understand exactly what kind of practices were working and what were like more effective, essentially increasing productivity. Because I was also thinking that, you know, like sometimes you can also observe, you know, that management can be, you know, like it can be self-serving in a way, like they can serve their own purpose. You can be more like very bureaucratic, essentially, in a way, and then the management can have, like, because it wants to survive, then it may have different objectives from the, you know, like the firm and so on, which essentially leads to like this principal agent kind of conflict. You know? So do you have any evidence on that? Like, are there some practices that were maybe detrimental or negative in a way, and some aspects that were more positive? And my second question is about like when you think of management within the production function and its relationship to technology in particular. So I was thinking, like, to what extent is it constrained by technology or shaped by technology? And it struck me like this interesting example that you brought up about the contrast between the first industrial revolution and the second. And I was thinking, is this because of the nature of technology, essentially, that dictated the type of management that could have been implemented in each? Maybe the electrification, the shift to engines and like different type of engines and so on. This might have made it, you know, like more difficult, essentially, to be innovative or thinking outside the box and so on. And then like this relationship between innovation and management, which is related to the first point. Thank you.
Yeah, no, thank you for the questions. So I'll start from the second one. So if we think about the production function, so we have some combination of capital and labor, and then we have an A in front of the production function, we can think that management affects the A in the production function. And so that higher level of management makes the inputs more productive. And I totally agree with you that the change between the first and the second industrial revolution could be due to the differences in production, and in particular the fact that jobs became mostly standardized and over-specialized during the second industrial revolution. And so there was more need of coordination across workers that were doing just one piece of the production, rather than during the first industrial revolution, in which the workman was also producing a piece on its own. So that's for sure. In terms of which practices were more effective, if we do heterogeneity analysis, definitely human resources management was the practice that affected productivity in general firm performance the most, even if to some extent all practices had a positive effect on firm performance. There is also evidence, I didn't have time to show it today, of complementarities among practices. That goes back to the Toyota hypothesis that good management is a virtuous cycle. So we start with some practices, we get better, we implement even more practices, we get even better, and so on. We can also think on the other way around. We don't implement any practices, we become worse, and we continue not to implement practices, we become even worse, and eventually we fail, for sure. So in this case, I don't think there is a clear evidence, at least during the war, in terms of implementation of self-serving practices. And I think it could be due to two reasons. So first of all, we're talking about a war economy, and so these are firms in the defense industry. We can think that they were at least to some extent constrained by what the government want them to do, but also that the training within the industry had the goal of training the entire management, not just the top executive or the CEOs of the companies, but like train some key figures within the company that should have trained middle managers, they should have trained production supervisors, they should have trained the rest of the workers. So in this case, I think that there is less margin for the implementation of these self-serving practices, which is more common when there are CEOs or top executive running the business. So we can think about higher scale managerial practices that could shape the financial structure, strategic investment of the firms, and practices more related to their core production, like in this case.
So I'm going to bring in I'm going to voice a question from the online, but then we're going to come here in the front row and have a couple of student question and then to Greg, okay? So this is from an anonymous user. So my request for names didn't quite work, did it? That's the management training that I've received.
It's not a threat.
No, I know. But I think they ask an interesting question, because they're asking about how World War II era management practices influence even longer term productivity in the US. To some extent, is there a kind of ceiling of an effect, I guess is how one of the reasons I want to put this. You know, you show us this amazingly lovely long-term effect, and it seems to taper, right? Is it because all the potential's fulfilled from this kind of batch of practices, or is there a kind of even longer term story that you flag?
Yeah, so here there is a data limitation in the sense that we are able to follow firms for 10 years after
Which is
implementation.
impressive, right?
Yeah, but there could be even more going on. And the fact that the effect settled down at the end of the period is mostly due by the fact that firms in a control group at some point start catching up. So they didn't much for like 7-8 years, and then they do a little bit better, at least in terms of sales, not necessarily in terms of productivity. If you look at the Italian case, the effects are longer, because we have 15 years of data after the implementation of the program. It looks like that the productivity effect continued to increase. I also searched how many of treated and comparison firms survived up to 2010, and I still find that firms that got the training program survived, the higher rated firms that did not. Up to 2010, of course, we can think about it as a super selective sample, in the sense that I only have a handful number of firms, but it looks like there is something going on even farther than the 10-15 years that we're looking here.
Thank you, on behalf of an anonymous user. Let's come to the front row here, and then we'll go over to Greg afterwards. Okay? Sorry, I forget, I don't know your name.
That's okay, don't worry. Can I be heard?
It's
Yeah, okay. Closer, like that. I have two questions, but they're very brief. The first question is, I think it's quite clear, especially with the war effort and then the war reconstruction in Europe through the Marshall Plan, these...
we can't quite hear. So
Sorry,
that's better.
is that better? I said it's quite clear with the war effort and then the war reconstruction through the Marshall Plan that these productivity increases are quite state-driven in a way, and I was wondering about whether there was a large role of the state in Japanese productivity increases, and then the reactionary kind of productivity increase in the US, and kind of what the role of the state was there. And then the other question was related to the spillover effects in the years after the war in the US, and I was just wondering, could we look at kind of firm level data using like some sort of kind of census data to track the movement of managers from firms that saw productivity increases to firms that perhaps didn't, and see if there was, is that I know that would kind of require quite a large amount of data, but is there kind of a way there to track firm level spillover?
Yeah, so to answer your first question, yes, most of the intervention were state-driven, both in the US and in Europe, and I would say also in Japan. It's like these training trips for Japanese managers were organized mostly by the US, that were coordinating and helping the reconstruction effort, even in Japan. Definitely the role of the governments in fostering this program decreased over time. I don't think that in the 70s or in the 80s there was such a big role of the state, at least in relation of this program anymore. But it was more the private initiative of seeing Japanese firms doing better and realizing that it could be related to management and try to learn out of it. In terms of your questions about spillovers, yes, definitely that would be a great analysis to do in order to see which kind of knowledge managers bring with them when they change firms, which also speaks to how easy it is to implement a set of practices from one firm to another. One thing that I didn't specify during the presentation, but I think that it's important, is that we do not observe all the firms in the economy, so this analysis is only made on firms, on other work contractors for which we have the performance data that were close to firms that were treated. So there could definitely be spillovers effect that we are not able to capture because we don't have the full market structure of the economy. Maybe in smaller firms there was more spillovers. This is something that our analysis is not able to document.
Thank you. We're going to go to Greg next in the middle there, and after Greg to Matt, because that's the easy pass.
Thank you. I'm going to cross over slightly into a couple of questions that you've had, but with a more specific example. It seems to me that the period that you're covering, the wartime and the reconstruction, is the period that delivers a really clear objective function. Do this and do it better. And that's the high point of the introduction of mathematical quantitative techniques to management, like linear programming and so forth, which is teachable and relatively transferable. But once you've done it, it just becomes standard practice. It's not, and it may well explain why some of the graphs flatten out. But once you've done that, and I think this is possibly where management then faces actually a completely different set of challenges, you then have to deal with much more, as it were, softer or wickeder problems around, for example, corporate culture or labour relations and the relative returns to labour and capital.
Yes, so no, this is definitely true. I have to say that in general, the type of practices that are taught in business training program have not changed very much. So even if some practices, especially those related to factory operations or, I don't know, wasted inventories and so on, should be by now pretty straightforward, there is still a substantial variation on the number of firms that are systematically implemented these practices. Or maybe, to be more precise, it's not that they do not want to implement these practices, it's that they're not aware of how many inefficiencies their firms have. So it's definitely clear that the production function during the war was very clear, during the reconstruction was very clear. Now challenges are more. There is also more complex implementation of practices in relation of human capital. This is more and more specialized, machineries, and in general inputs. But the fact that the productivity spreads and management spreads are so large and so persistent seems to indicate that firms are not able to catch up that well, even in modern times. So it's not that once a managerial practice becomes the standard, all firms systematically implement it.
Okay, we're going to go to Matt in the middle there, so two along from Greg.
Thank you for the talk. That was really good. So I was wondering how connected the TWI applicants that get selected, their location is to military bases. Basically, how connected, how integrated is the program with military interests? And do you see that as part of the story, given how much internal migration there is in the U.S. during this period? Dragging people from agriculture maybe into industry, they need more training around the workers that way. And then on the follow-up, those boom towns kind of persist afterwards, so does that feed into kind of their better performance?
Yes, so in terms of which firms eventually received training, we do not find evidence of any spatial correlation. So the fact that instructors were not enough to train everyone seems the main constraint that the program faced. And firms were kind of put in a waiting list. So even firms that eventually were not trained were taught that they would have trained at some point. So the program was shut down all of a sudden in 1945, in August 1945, which is when World War II ended. But they were still having open application for firms. So I think there was, at least from the program administrator, the willingness to continue and to eventually train all firms. So there is not this kind of choice, at least in the years in which we observe the production. In terms of migration, it could definitely be that there was a reallocation of workers, or in general migration, in particular in the 50s, in the 60s. I don't think, since the distribution of firms that we're training is quite homogeneous, I don't think that that affects our results much. We do see larger effects in the Northeast and in the Midwest, that are also the most industrialized areas of the country, but the effects are pretty large, even if we look at the other areas, in particular the South, the West. We still find pretty sizable effects there too.
Brilliant. We're going to go over to the that side of the room. So Eric and then Andrea, so you're beside each other, so you can hold the microphone in the spirit of efficiency.
Thank you very much. That was fascinating. I guess, can I ask you to zoom out a little bit? And so, when we're thinking about policy implications, like this seems to be targeted at manufacturing firms. And of course, we've experienced deindustrialization now. So do you think these practices would be as effective in the service sector? Because that's kind of, I think, what European countries need is, efficiency beyond manufacturing.
That's true that most firms were in manufacturing sectors, and in general, when we're thinking about managerial practices, increasing productivity, we are mostly thinking about the manufacturing sector. So there were some firms that were operating in other industries, even back then, in particular in services, and we do find an effect also for these firms. There is an increasing body of work talking about efficiency in the service sector, and it looks like that even in service sectors, the variation in practices is quite outstanding. The effect there seems, however, more driven by who are the managers, who can get different names across of different sectors, of course. But it looks like that having a good managers make the office, the services offered much more productive than having a bad manager, more than a set of practices as those that we discussed today.
Thank you, Michela. This was fantastic. I'm going to ask you to zoom in, perhaps, and think about the TWI intervention much more closely. Because I was sort of intrigued by how these 50 hours of training caused persistent change in behaviors and practices within these firms, right? So one could have this very optimistic view of training and having this very direct impact on behaviors, but I'm wondering if perhaps these changes were not also mediated perhaps by organizational changes within these firms, or how were these principles and practices codified is the question I would like to ask you. And perhaps connected to this as well, I was also intrigued by the fact that this was more due to changes in management than the role of managers themselves, right? So how does this story intersect with a formal education in management and perhaps these firms attracting those people who believed in these principles to begin with? So can you speak about these two issues?
Yeah, no, definitely. So for sure, during the war, there was a huge effort from the government, and in particular, the training within the industry administrator to convince firms that management was important. This was done through a lot of advertising, even for firms that weren't part of the training. So, like, this idea was definitely in the air, if we can say this way. In terms of why relatively short training had such long-lasting effects, well, first of all, we have to think about the implementation of practices at the baseline that in those years was very, very low. You're talking about less than 5% of applicants implementing any of these practices. So even if the training was short, the baseline was so low that the effects could be that big at least in part due to that, on the one end. On the other end, the principle of the training within the industry was to offer the training to top management, but then have this training to be scaled up. So 50 hours of training is for the top management, but then there was training of the job for all the workers that is definitely much more intensive than that what the instructor gave. And in fact, one of the reasons why this program was implemented during the war was exactly that the idea of this kind of amplification effect. We train a few people, and if they can transmit the knowledge within the firm, then we can see even bigger results.
I'm afraid that we are at the close. I know there are a number of people who are disappointed by not having had the opportunity to ask their questions. Those of you online, I'm heartily sorry. Those of you in the room, please join us afterwards to grab Michela and ask your question outside, where we'll have a brief reception to mingle and say thank you. But for now, let us all join together and thank Michela once again for a fabulous...